Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today's show is with Amir Tibon, senior editor for Haaretz newspaper in Israel, and we are going to be discussing what is currently happening in Israel with their domestic politics, judicial reforms, the current scope and scale of the Netanyahu coalition. So, Amir, first, I wanted to thank you for joining us today.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you guys for inviting me.
Traditionally in the United States, when we hear right-wing and left-wing, the fault lines that our politics divide along, it's right-wing is more socially conservative. There's a religious element to how they view culture, and also they tend to be more pro-corporation. I was wondering if you could help us understand maybe some of the broad fault lines that the left and right-wing break down along in Israel.
Absolutely. And the Israeli and American political systems are so wildly different that I always am suspicious of attempts to compare them one to the other because, even if we look at the election system, they're just worlds apart. But when we define right-wing and left-wing in Israel, historically, it was mostly related to the Palestinian issue. If you go even more back in history to the 1950s, 1960s, the early decades of Israel, it was more about economic issues. And in a way, maybe a little more similar to the division in the United States, where the left ruled Israel, and it was a more social democratic, some would even argue socialist state. And the right wing was in opposition and wanted a more capitalist market economy. But for the last 40-something years, that really hasn't been the fault line. The main issue has been the question of what to do with the occupied territories. Some people here call it Judea and Samaria, some would call it the West Bank. It's the area that Israel took over in the Six-Day War in 1967, which is home to 2.5 to 3 million Palestinians and also to hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers. And the main question, the main dividing line was, what are we going to do with this territory? Are we going to keep it, annex it, make it part of Israel? Is it going to become the location of a future Palestinian state? Maybe something in between. But I would argue that in the last decade, perhaps, and maybe more, this is no longer the main dividing line in Israel. And today, when we talk about right-wing and left-wing in Israel, it's a bit outdated because the dramas that are rocking Israeli politics right now are not about the Palestinian issue and not about the settlements and the occupation. Those issues are still critically important to the future of our country. And personally, if you ask me, they are the most important question we have to deal with. The controversies of today are not focused on that. And it's also not about economic policy. Economic policy in Israel has not been the main theme of our politics for a long time. So when we're talking today about the divisions in Israeli politics, I would say that they're moreover the fault line of religious versus secular liberal. The main question today is, when we talk about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, which component should be stronger, the Jewish or the democratic? That's what we're fighting about for the last few years here in Israel. And if you're following the headlines right now from the country with huge demonstrations over the Netanyahu government's plan to change the balance of power between the government and the judicial branch, that is really what is at the heart of it, the question of the balance between religion and state, Judaism and democracy.
Amir, we're going to talk a lot about the state of democracy in the country. That's going to be a big theme of our discussion. But I want to follow up on something that you mentioned as you described the long-term trajectory of the left and right axes in Israeli politics. I think that you very rightly pointed out the importance of the Palestine issue, what to do with the West Bank, the territory that's been occupied since 1967. And because you mentioned that it's been a polarizing issue in Israeli politics, that there's at certain points in that 60-year trajectory been different camps with different ideas about what to do, it's kind of striking that it doesn't seem like there's really been a lot of progress, at least from a distance, us looking at it from abroad. It seems like it's really kind of been one consistent story, and that no matter who's been in power, nothing really has changed. Is that inaccurate? When people in power might have had a different view about the Palestinian issue, did anything different really happen?
First of all, it's important to say that if we look since 1977, which is when the Israeli right wing, the Likud party, first took power in Israel, and that's now it's 46 years soon. the left has barely held power ever since. It's mostly been right-wing governments in Israel, some of them with participation by left-wing parties, because again, unlike the US, where you have a two-party system and you directly elect the president, in Israel, we have coalition governments in a parliamentary system. And so the right wing has mostly been in power, sometimes with left-wing parties in the coalition, and there have been short periods of time where you actually had left-wing governments. I would say in the last 46 years, that happened for less than a decade combined. Still, with that in mind, I think when we talk about the fate of the West Bank, the occupied territories, we need to pull back for a second and look at the bigger picture of the results of the Six-Day War. Because in 1967, Israel didn't just conquer the West Bank, it also conquered the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. And then began an interesting process of Israel deciding which territories that it occupied in that war it wants to keep and which territories it's willing to give back in return for peace agreements. So in 1978, we had the peace agreement with Egypt, brokered by President Carter. And after that, the next big step in the 1990s, it was the Oslo Accords, signed by the government of Yitzhak Rabin, which basically gave the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, very limited levels of control in parts of the West Bank, mainly the big Palestinian cities, and created the Palestinian Authority. And that infrastructure remains until today. Through all the fighting and the terror attacks and the bloodshed, still the Palestinian Authority controls some areas of the West Bank and has some limited governing capacities. And in 2005, a government led by Likud and by Ariel Sharon, who was a very right-wing prime minister, decided to pull all the Israeli troops and take down all the Israeli settlements from Gaza. And we're talking here about the 8,000 settlers guarded by tens of thousands of Israeli soldiers who lived among 2 million Palestinians. It was completely unsustainable, and Sharon decided to put an end to it. And the Gaza Strip today is controlled by Hamas, although Israel still surrounds it from three directions and has military superiority. It's not anymore in control inside Gaza. But what happened in the West Bank is that we got stuck. The Palestinian Authority that was created because of Oslo was not supposed to be a permanent solution. It was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be a roadblock to the creation of the Palestinian state. But that never materialized. And if we start talking about why it never materialized and who's to blame, I got to tell you guys, we're not going to finish in an hour. We're going to need a whole seminar for this. But the bottom line is that it never materialized, and it's been completely stuck, I would argue, for more than 2 decades now. And most Israelis have lost interest in this issue, not because it's not important for our lives. It's probably the most important for our lives. They've lost interest because they don't believe anything can change. And it has to do also with the fact that we have a dual political crisis right now in Israel and in the Palestinian political arena. In both sides, there is complete dysfunctional governments. And on the Palestinian side, Hamas, which controls Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority, they are basically in a cold civil war, if you will. And Israel these days doesn't look so great either in terms of unity and a sense of joint purpose. So that's a very long answer to this, to explain why we've seen progress in other fronts, but in the West Bank, it's completely stuck.
Benjamin Netanyahu is returning as Israeli prime minister. His new far-right coalition is being sworn in by parliament today. The incoming government is regarded as the most right-wing in Israel's history and includes several ultra-Orthodox and ultra-nationalist parties. The coalition has vowed to expand settlements in the occupied West Bank and other disputed areas. It's the sixth government formed by Netanyahu, who is still on trial for alleged corruption.
You touched on the importance of coalition building in Israeli politics, how in a parliamentary system, it's often necessary for parties to group together to form a government. And that seems to be a big part of why the current political moment is so striking. We know that Bibi Netanyahu has been the longest serving ever Israeli prime minister. He's been in power a long time, and he's always been polarizing and controversial. But right now it seems different. It seems like there's something about the current coalition that's even more extreme, even more striking, even more controversial than maybe ever before. And I wanted to see if you could help us kind of characterize the makeup of this coalition. What makes it different? What are the parties that have aligned with Likud?
The responses that this election has generated in this public in Israel are unprecedented. And, people who read Haaretz and live in Tel Aviv or in smaller liberal cities and communities across the country, they've been used for many, many years to living under the rule of the Israeli right wing, and specifically under Netanyahu. He previously won elections in 2009, in 2013, in 2015, and you never saw until recently a phenomenon where 10 weeks straight, hundreds of thousands of Israelis take to the streets to demonstrate against his government. You never heard people from the liberal side of Israel talk about opening foreign bank accounts and getting their money out of the country. We've been having headlines here for the last 2-3 weeks of pilots in the Israeli Air Force reserves declaring that if the Netanyahu government will go along with the plan to weaken the Israeli judiciary, they will stop serving in the military, which is an extreme step to take in such a militaristic society like Israel, and specifically from Air Force pilots who are so proud usually of their service and what they do. You never saw this in 2014, 2017, 2019. All of these are years when Netanyahu was in power. So what's different this time? Why are we seeing this very unusual reaction from the liberal side of Israel? It's because people feel that while Netanyahu is the devil they know, and they've gotten used to him, like him or hate him, the government he has formed this time is a different kind of animal. It's the most extreme and the most religious government in Israeli history. In our parliament, in the Knesset, there are overall 120 seats, and to have a majority, a government needs to have 61. This coalition has 64, and out of them, 32, half of the majority seats, belong to religious parties of different sorts. This is an unprecedented situation in Israeli history. This is really the first government in Israeli history where the religious forces are a majority of the governing coalition. And the reason they want to weaken the judicial system is not for the sake of having a weaker court. That is not the purpose. That is an instrument. They want to weaken the judicial system, and specifically the Supreme Court, because they view it, rightly so, as a liberalizing force in Israeli society. A lot of the progress that has been made in Israel in recent decades on issues like LGBT rights, women's rights, equality for minorities, was not reached through legislation in the parliament, but through decisions of the Supreme Court and the way the Supreme Court interpreted what we call the basic laws of the State of Israel. And for the religious parties, it's long been a dream to weaken the Supreme Court so that they can change course and overturn some of those liberalizing decisions. Netanyahu never played along with it. He saw himself as the leader of a liberal-leaning right-wing party. Likud historically was considered a liberal national party, which means they were, militaristic and right-wing and hawkish on security issues, but open-minded and tolerant on issues of religion and state and civil rights. The reason he's now willing to go along has to do with his corruption trial. Maybe we can talk about it later, but that's what has elicited this strong and determined and fearful reaction from large segments of the Israeli public. It's a sense that it's not about Netanyahu this time. It's about the people governing with him.
In my mind, I get a vivid recollection of what the right wing here in the United States politics has done for 60 years, maybe not through legislative reforms, but through trying to win elections to get their type of Supreme Court candidate on the court. A lot of these social issues where the court has been a liberalizing influence has also pissed off our right wing. But I wanted to dig in a little bit more specifically into the type of legislative reforms that Netanyahu and his coalition is proposing. Because if you read an article or two, depending on the source, you see the headline, it's very clear that a lot of folks think that this is a push towards autocracy, a push towards a different type of regime. How much of these reforms are truly trying to usher in a new regime, and how much maybe is there a little bit of hyperbole being used in the media?
I think when you look at the entire legislative proposal put forth by the government, Most of its components, each and by themselves, are completely legitimate. If you took one of the components and enacted it within a healthier and balanced judicial reform, I don't think there would be such a public outcry and warnings of the end of democracy. The problem is the entire package. And I'll give you a few examples. One of the most important things they include is an override clause. What is an override clause? Basically, today in Israel, if the Knesset enacts legislation and the Supreme Court decides that this legislation contradicts one of the basic laws of the State of Israel, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but we do have a set of basic laws that have a higher standing in our judicial system and can be used by the court for the purpose of conducting judicial review. And so if the court says that new legislation or action by the government contradicts the basic law on liberty and human dignity, it can strike down that law. Now, today, in the current situation, the government or the legislator has to accept the court's decision. But what they want to do, they want to introduce an override clause that will give a certain majority in the Knesset the ability to override the Supreme Court's decision. So, for example, if tomorrow this government, which is very religious, as I said, and has a very different vision for Israel than what you would see in the streets of Tel Aviv today, if it decided to pass laws that discriminate against women or LGBT Israelis, and the Supreme Court decided to strike them down, they would give the smallest possible majority in the Knesset, 61 seats, the ability to override the Supreme Court decision, and that would be the end of discussion. Now, if you ask me personally, I don't think an override clause by itself is such a terrible idea. I can understand the logic that certain decisions, if they have such a wide consensus in Israeli society, that consensus and that representation in public opinion should overcome the decision of the Supreme Court. But I think the majority has to be much higher than the smallest of possibilities, 61. When you talk about 61, you're giving unopposed and unrestricted power to the government. But it doesn't start or stop here. Another component they want to add is to severely limit the Supreme Court's ability to conduct judicial review in the first place. They want any decision to strike down Knesset legislation to be accepted by 80% of the justices of the Supreme Court. So you mentioned earlier some historic Supreme Court decisions in the US, and I think some of them were decisions that were made by the court on a majority of 5-4 or 6-3. That wouldn't work if this government's proposal would be accepted here in Israel. We have 15 justices on our Supreme Court. They want 12 of them to vote in unison in order to strike down legislation. Now think about it. They are raising a very, very high bar for any Supreme Court decision to strike down legislation, but at the same time, the Knesset has the lowest possible bar to override the Supreme Court with 61. Again, that is completely not balanced. And then there is another important component, which is the selection of the judges. Today in Israel, judges are selected by a committee that has equal representation for politicians from the Knesset, the lawyers' bar, and sitting judges. This committee has come under a lot of criticism in recent years because of all kinds of backroom deal-making and allegations of corruption. And I think there is a wide consensus in the country that it needs to be reformed. But the proposal that the government is putting forward right now would basically give the government an automatic majority on this committee. And so what we'll have is a government that can appoint the judges by itself without any need for consultation with the opposition or with the judicial authority. In order to strike down legislation, the judges and the justices picked by this government would need to reach an 80% consensus, which is almost impossible. And on top of that, if by any chance the justices selected exclusively by the government would reach a point where 80% of them think legislation is so horrible that it needs to be eliminated, the Knesset could still reinstate that legislation with the smallest possible majority of 61. Again, each one of these components on its own, in a more moderate version, I think it's completely part of a legitimate debate about the boundaries of democracy and the division of power between the different authorities. But when you combine them together, what you get is a pretty grim picture that basically means there is no real judicial review. And it's especially important in Israel because unlike in the US, we don't have a clear separation here between the legislative and the executive. In the US, it's very clear that the Senate and the House of Representatives are different bodies than the presidency. And in fact, it's quite often that at least one of them, the House or the Senate, will be controlled by the opposition party, the one that is not currently holding the White House. In Israel, because of how our politics works, the government always enjoys a majority in the Knesset. So de facto, you don't really have separation between the legislative and the executive, which makes the judicial branch the only real check on the government's power. If you have a government that can exclusively select the judges and put a very, very high bar for the judges to conduct judicial review, and on top of it, the majority in the Knesset can cancel the judge's decision quite easily, I think it's a real argument then if this is still a democracy.
Amir, you describe how, from your perspective, each of these reforms might be acceptable independently, but when they're combined, it eliminates the effectiveness of judicial review. I mean, from my perspective, even just the override, if the override is just a simple majority, if you just take only that aspect and leave aside the appointment of judges, you leave aside the requirement for 80% consensus, even if you just have that override rule, that basically makes judicial review completely nullified because it's the same amount of votes that you need to pass a piece of legislation allows you to override, then you can just immediately override anything that's also able to pass.
It's true, but I personally think the most dangerous of the components, even more than the 61 override clause, is the judicial appointment selection. Let's take the US system, for example, as a point to compare. In the United States, the president nominates judges and Supreme Court justices, and then the Senate holds a vote in front of the entire Senate, and that vote is completely public in front of the cameras. And senators in the US are elected directly by the people in their states, which means that if you're a Republican or a Democratic senator, it's true, you have an identity that comes from your party, but you also owe something to the voters in your state. And there are enough swing states still today in American politics that sometimes senators from the president's party will actually vote against a candidate the president put forward. And of course, I'm not even talking about the fact that once in a while, you guys in America actually have a Senate that is controlled by the opposite party from the one sitting in the White House. We saw at the time the Republicans block Mary Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court. They didn't even give him a hearing. I don't know if that's something we want to aspire to, but it shows you that there are real limitations on the political appointments of judges and justices in the United States. And I don't think your system is perfect. I think far from it, but just as a point of comparison. What they want to do here is have a small committee where the government has an automatic majority and can choose the representatives, be the ones selecting the judges. So who would be appointed to represent the government in this judicial committee? It won't be the Mitt Romneys and the Susan Collinses of the Israeli government. It would be the Ted Cruzes and the Marjorie Taylor Greens. It would be the extremists who would vote according to party line, not look right, left, front or behind, and just do whatever they're told and whatever pleases the base. And so you would have a highly politicized and loyal to the government Supreme Court, and that would make the override clause unnecessary in a way, because the idea that these kinds of justices would vote against the wishes of the government that appointed them for political reasons would be very low to begin with.
So, Amir, I think what you've just described fits into another aspect of all of this that you hinted at before. And that has to do with why Netanyahu in particular is interested in pursuing these kinds of reforms and how it might impact the corruption trials that are ongoing. You talk about how the government would be able to essentially pick the personnel in the Supreme Court without much check from even the legislature. I'm wondering if this is something that's going to be relevant in these corruption trials. Can you tell us a little bit about the connection?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's important to note that historically Netanyahu blocked initiatives like this coming from the religious right wing for many, many years. And you can go back to the archive and you will find interviews with Netanyahu from 5 and 7 and 10 years ago, where he proudly says that he has been blocking attempts to weaken the Supreme Court. And he praises the Israeli Supreme Court for being an important defender of democracy And he speaks about how highly appreciated the Israeli Supreme Court is on the world stage. And so that's something that he used to talk about all these years. Now suddenly he's flipped and he's joining forces with the extremists and the ultra-religious lawmakers that want to weaken the court. And you have to wonder, why did this happen? What has changed? And of course, the likeliest answer is now he's a defendant himself, and he's got a corruption trial ongoing in the Jerusalem District Court for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. And no matter the result of this corruption trial, there will be an appeal to the Supreme Court. And so it will be very important for Netanyahu to decide who are Israel's next Supreme Court justices. And by the way, another important component to consider from an American point of view, in the US, judicial appointments are lifetime appointments. So actually every government or administration or president, if you will have very few chances to appoint Supreme Court justices, because if it's a lifetime appointment, you need someone to die or retire in order to have the chance to make an appointment of your own. In Israel, Supreme Court justices have to retire at the age of 70. That's the law. And so if you have enough justices that are a bit older, a government that is in power for 2 or 3 years can choose half of the Supreme Court. And for a person who is a criminal defendant in a case that is about to reach the Supreme Court in a year or two, that is a critical lever of power to have in your hands if you can have your government choose these Supreme Court justices.
Can you help us understand the views and the motivations of folks maybe outside of Netanyahu who don't have a direct court case that they could potentially be trying to influence? And more specifically, I look at the United States, and one of the reasons given to not remove the filibuster if you're a Republican or Democrat is eventually you're going to be out of power. And maybe a party with different values will come into power and change everything in a direction that you don't agree with. And just listening to the reforms that you're outlining, it sounds like that if a more secular liberal party came into power, they could undo a lot of what this government is trying to accomplish. Is there any concerns from the other members of the coalition that, hey, Israeli politics may not always be like it currently is today, and these reforms are opening up Israel to future, maybe more liberal, secular changes that this coalition is currently staunchly against?
You do hear that a little bit, and especially now when the liberal public in Israel has awoken and is strongly fighting back, and you're seeing these massive demonstrations. I think when they started working on these judicial changes, there was a sense that this government is drunk on power and that they just won an election. And remember, it came after 5 election rounds within 3.5 years. We like to be the only democracy in the Middle East, but maybe that's a little too much. And that was already creating a sense of crisis. And so when this government finally won in the 5th round of the election and secured a majority, I think they were euphoric. And they thought there would be no tomorrow. And maybe they thought that because of demographic changes in Israeli society, basically the country becoming more religious because religious people have more children, that they could rule forever. And that whatever they do now will not come back to haunt them because the other side will not ever get back to power. And I think some people in this governing coalition are beginning to regret that notion, because we're seeing polls in Israeli media in the last few weeks showing the current opposition, made up of the more liberal forces, gaining a majority if an election took place today. Now, of course, the likelihood of an election happening again in the next few months is not very high. We could speak later, if you want, about the one scenario where I can see an election take place this year. But I think the more scary part is that some of these people in the government, not everyone, but some of the people in this government are not so committed to democracy. And if they had the power to do it, they wouldn't mind changing the election laws in a way that would guarantee their hold on power. These are very religious people, some of them with a messianic understanding of the world. And until now, they've been limited, even when they were in power, by Israel's Supreme Court, and also by, I think, Netanyahu's own moderation on some issues, and also by the understanding that Israel badly needs the United States, and the United States is a democracy, a liberal democracy on most days, that wants to see shared values as an important component of its relationship with Israel. And I think some of these people really, they're on a power trip. and they think they can do whatever they want and there will not be consequences. It's beginning to change because of the very strong opposition in the streets in Israel. And I would argue actually that a decisive comment on this issue from the Biden administration would also be rattling to a lot of people because of how important the US is for Israel's national security. But I think if you asked some of Netanyahu's coalition partners, especially the more religious ones, they would basically tell you Israel's Jewish identity is more important than democracy. And if, in order to maintain the Jewish character of the country, we need to fix the laws a little bit and have a little less democracy and maybe have elections, but not necessarily free and fair ones, that's a fair price to pay. Obviously, for more liberal Israelis, and also, I think for some voters of Netanyahu's Likud party, that's an unacceptable position.
Amir, talking about the Israeli attitudes towards democracy reminds me kind of the regional arguments and the regional trends, especially in the last decade after the Arab Spring. And 10 years ago, around 2011, there was a move to democratize the Arab world. And then there was a big backlash to that move. And I think a lot of the attitude that drove those counter-revolutions, the backlash to democracy, was a narrative that was promoted by especially the Arab Gulf states, that democracy led to instability, a bad economy. The best way to have stability in the Middle East was to have especially a monarchy, but also perhaps another form of autocratic government, a backstop on majority rule to prevent dangerous people from coming to power. And that in the region, the most successful, the most stable, the most secure countries were the autocracies. This was a way of thinking that has really spread around the region in the time since. We've seen how even a lot of the public in Egypt and Tunisia supported those counter-revolutions because they bought into this narrative that autocracy was safer. And I'm wondering if this mindset that you're describing among some members of the Israeli governing coalition are maybe influenced in any way by that regional trend, that their skeptical or dubious attitudes towards the value of democracy in the first place might be influenced by this way of thinking in the region that autocracy is actually better for the Middle East.
I don't think it's a direct influence. I don't think these people wake up and look at Egypt and Tunisia and other countries in the region for inspiration. I think they're much more focused on the Bible as a source of inspiration, and the halacha and Talmud and basically the Jewish religious tradition. But I think if anything has made a difference is that there are forces today in the United States that accept this argument. If you look back 15, 20 years ago, there was quite a consensus in the American political system that democracy is important, and specifically democracy in the Middle East. Of course, that did not always lead to good results. We saw the Bush administration's attempt to bring democracy to the Middle East end up as a total disaster. But I think politicians in Israel couldn't even think about getting away with measures against democracy inside Israel because it was clear that the United States, our most important ally, will simply not accept it. Certainly not under a Democratic administration, but also not under a Republican administration. Think how embarrassing it would have been for the Bush administration to have these kinds of events happening in Israel, a backslide on democracy, an attempt to create an autocratic regime, at the same time that this administration was promoting democracy in other countries in the region. I think with Trump taking power in 2016, there was a big change because Trump spoke about other leaders in this region as my favorite dictator and was completely uninterested in human rights in any neighboring country and accepted people who cut journalists to pieces. There was just no more commitment to democracy. And that is a message that was very clearly received in the Israeli right wing. And I think that the one biggest disappointment for Netanyahu right now is that with this very right-wing, very religious government, he's stuck with a democratic administration and an evenly divided Congress. That's Netanyahu's biggest headache right now, aside from the demonstrations in Israel, because it is limiting his ability to say, you know what, I don't care about these protests, and the ability to use force to disperse the demonstrations is limited when you have Washington watching you and the American Jewish community looking in horror at what's happening here. But the Trump message that democracy is not important had a very strong impact on what the Israeli right wing considers possible. Things that perhaps some people outside of the extreme religious right considered impossible, even if they wanted to do it 15 or 20 years ago, they think perhaps now they can get away with it.
You brought up our American government being a headache for Prime Minister Netanyahu. Many consistent American defenders of Israel, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, you have columnists like Jennifer Rubin, former politicians as well. 80 House Democrats have spoken out against the judicial reforms. Might this be a moment in U.S. and Israeli political history where the ironclad U.S. alignment with Israel since the 90s is finally going to crack?
I think it's been cracking for a long time. And I think we saw signs of it under the Obama administration when Netanyahu came to Congress to give a speech against Obama's foreign policy 2 weeks before an Israeli election, basically using the U.S. Congress as a prop in his election campaign and attacking Obama to help Republicans along the way. And of course, nothing in terms of policy came out of that speech. And it was obvious that his speech is not going to stop the Iran nuclear deal. And if anything, it only helped solidify support for Obama among the Democratic Party. But that was one important moment. We saw in the Trump years several important moments where basically Netanyahu was seen as someone who's taking sides in American politics. And this alignment that Netanyahu and Trump had, I like to say, because I was living in the U.S. During the Trump years. I was sent by Haaretz to be the Washington correspondent, and I was there for the entire Trump presidency. And I traveled around the country a lot. I think I went to 24 states, and I spoke at many Jewish communities. And one thing that I realized is that the 4 years of Trump and Netanyahu caused more harm to Israel in American Jewish public opinion than 50 years of occupation. People who defended Israel, and you mentioned Jennifer Rubin, I think that's a great example. People who defended Israel against accusations of using too much force against the Palestinians and against the apartheid comparisons and things like that, and of course opposed BDS. And we're always critical of Obama for being too tough on Israel. These same people, when they saw Netanyahu hugging Trump and talking about him as the new Messiah, they had a breaking point with Israel suddenly. And it wasn't about the occupation. It was about the perception that Netanyahu and Trump are one and the same, and that Netanyahu was bringing Trump's politics to Israel, although I would argue it's the opposite. Trump, I think, borrowed a lot from Netanyahu's earlier playbook. And this crisis could intensify and get even worse if the government will eventually put forward these changes to the judicial system. I think it will be a larger and more definitive breaking point for Israel and the Democratic Party and the American Jewish community. Israel will still have support from the Republican Party, from the evangelical Christians, forces in American politics and society today who are less committed to liberal democracy. That's a polite way to say it. But for those who are committed to liberal democracy, it will be extremely hypocritical to still advocate for a close relationship the day after these changes become the new laws of the state of Israel. And so that is definitely a big concern for any Israeli patriot, because we all know how important the relationship with the United States is to our national security.
Just like you've said, Israel really has built their entire national security strategy around this relationship with the United States. The U.S. have always backed Israel on security matters, on political matters at the United Nations. I'm wondering what Israeli foreign security policy, Israel's position in the world even, would look like if this ironclad relationship with the U.S. did fall away dramatically. I mean, how do you think Israel would position itself if it could not depend on U.S. backing to the extent that it has for the last few decades?
So the truth is, nobody has a plan for that, because Israel doesn't really have an alternative to the United States. Israel is a small country, 9 and something million people. Yes, it has high tech. Yes, it has a good military. But really, the support of the United States doesn't just come out of a perception of joint interests. There is also a very strong component of shared values and an even stronger component of American politics. There is public opinion in the United States, which is a democratic country, that impacts politicians, presidents, senators, members of Congress, governors, to be supportive of Israel. If you leave the shared values and you give up on half of the political support because you turn Israel into a Republican issue, you are significantly weakening the relationship with the United States, and you don't really have an alternative. There is no public opinion in favor of Israel in Russia or China. And if you just look at interests as the sole motivating factor, Russia and China today have interests to support other countries in the region. They support Iran. We just saw the Chinese broker this Iranian-Saudi diplomatic breakthrough. And we're seeing Russia closely coordinated with Iran. They are now partners in the war against Ukraine. So if Israel decides that it's basically giving up on the United States at years where you have democratic administrations. Okay, I don't have any illusions about the Republican Party, although maybe in the future that could also change. But if you decide that every once in a while you just give up on American support, you have nowhere to go. And so it's a very irresponsible idea. And yes, some people in the Israeli right wing spoke in the past about getting closer to Putin and finding other allies, but there is really no substitute for the United States. And I don't see any other country in the world agreeing to provide Israel with $3.8 billion of military aid on an annual basis. It just doesn't exist.
Support for Israel is just so embedded in our politics that it's kind of stunning to see 80 House Democrats come out and make this rebuke. Lloyd Austin. In that vein, Amir, is there any approach that the Netanyahu coalition is taking to kind of calm things down and maybe take things back from the brink, specifically with relations to Democrats in the United States?
I don't think this current government can do it, because the values that are the glue that's stitching together this government are the complete opposite of the values of today's Democratic Party. And I'm not talking about the fringes of the Democratic Party, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. They would be against Israel no matter what Israel did. Okay, that's not the discussion. I'm talking about pro-Israeli lawmakers who have supported military aid to Israel and other forms of assistance and building a partnership for decades. People like Jerry Nadler from New York and Brad Sherman from California, who are now speaking out against this Netanyahu government because it's so extreme and it's pushing Israel away from democracy. And when you lose these people, you're basically left with no one outside of, again, the Republican Party. And okay, maybe Israel wants to become a party issue in American politics, and it wants to have a division over Israel like there is over abortion and guns. I would argue that that's disastrous for Israel. And the source of a lot of Israel's power in the international arena is this perception that Israel has wide and deep and long-standing support in Washington on both sides of the aisle, and it's a rare consensus issue. When you start to lose that, you lose a lot of power. And I think Netanyahu, as someone who spent many years of his life living and working in the United States and someone who understands the American system, he totally gets it. But he's governing right now with a coalition that just cannot make amends with Democrats. And again, not with the extreme Democrats, with the mainstream pro-Israeli liberal parts of the party. The distance between them and people like Netanyahu's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, far-right leader, who recently spoke about erasing a Palestinian village, and defines himself as a proud homophobe. What does he have in common with someone like Jerry Nadler? Apart from the fact that they're both Jewish. Okay, there are millions of Jews in the world. I mean, not everybody is a friend of everybody else just because they share the same religion.
If Israel were to just become a Republican issue, while the establishment Republicans would probably always support Israel, the far extreme right wing in our country right now, they just have overtones of xenophobia, of protectionism, of America first, as in America receding from the global stage, non-interventionism. We're talking about like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, the House Freedom Caucus, which is driving a lot of House Republican policy right now. So it just seems like putting all your eggs in one basket, and that basket having a bunch of crazy in it that could at any point pivot on a dime to maybe say they don't want to send foreign aid overseas.
I'm here to demonstrate and to sound my voice against the dictatorship that they establish here in the name of the so-called law, judicial reform. It's not a judicial reform. It's a revolution that's making Israel go to full dictatorship. And I want Israel to stay a democracy for my kids, for my grandson that will be here, because Israel is a democracy country, and it must stay as one.
I think we've seen for over 10 weeks now protests, and today and yesterday on Twitter, I saw pictures. It looked like, Amir, hundreds of thousands of people out protesting against these reforms. In the United States, we've had similar protests over police brutality, over other issues surrounding our democracy, where, maybe they're powerful for a month or two, but then after about a month or two, things start to recede into the background. The protests die down, the news cycle changes, and we kind of go on like business like usual. I guess my question for you is, looking at these protests in Israeli society, are we at a point where things are kind of plateauing, or is there still momentum growing for these protests and really no end in sight?
It is still growing from week to week, and I don't think it has yet to reach the full potential. I just look at my own social environment, and I see people who didn't go out to demonstrate a month ago suddenly joining the protests this weekend. From the point where we stand today, there are two diverging paths. One path is the path of compromise. It's the government saying, okay, we have run into a brick wall. There are massive demonstrations for 10 weeks in a row. That's never happened before in Israel, and it's not dying down. There is international criticism. Democrats in the US, President Macron of France saying that this pushes Israel away from the family of democracies, Germany warning that it's going to cause damage to Israel's relationship with Europe. And then there's the economic factor, the fear that the high-tech industry will be hurt and that talented and smart people will leave the country and will take their money outside of here. And it's already happening at the time when we're seeing higher interest rates in Israel and a weakening of our currency, the shekel against the dollar. So at some point, maybe some more reasonable people in this government will come and say, we need to soften dramatically this legislation. We can keep some of the components that change the balance of power between the government and the judicial system, but everything has to be much more moderate. And maybe then, there is compromise and things die down. And it doesn't mean that now everything's going to be kumbaya, because the tension between the liberal part of Israel and the religious parts of our society is not going away. People on both sides will feel that there is still a component of judicial review and that it's not hopeless for the liberal side to expect some of its rights to be protected even under this religious government. So that's one path. The other path is that the government moves along with the current legislation or does some cosmetic changes and tries to spin that as a big compromise, which is not going to work. People are very engaged right now. They're not going to buy a bad deal. And because if the government will make the override clause instead of 61, 63, when right now you have a coalition of 64 members, that's not going to convince anyone. Or if they add another opposition representative on the Judicial Appointments Committee, but the government still has a majority, nobody's going to be impressed. And so scenario number two is the government moves along with the current legislation, maybe a cosmetic change. It passes the Knesset, and then immediately there is an appeal to the Israeli Supreme Court against the legislation, arguing that it contradicts the basic laws of the State of Israel. And then that's really the constitutional crisis, moment of truth scenario, where the Supreme Court has to make a decision on this legislation that is meant to curtail the very same Supreme Court. And if it decides to strike down the legislation, all hell breaks loose. I'll give you a small example. One of the things the government wants to achieve through this legislation to weaken the judicial system is to appoint an ultra-Orthodox politician named Aryeh Deri. He's one of Netanyahu's coalition partners, to appoint him a government minister because the Supreme Court ruled 2 months ago that he's ineligible to serve in the government because he has a criminal past and a recent conviction in tax evasion. And so the Supreme Court said a person with that kind of background cannot serve as a minister in the government. Now the government wants to override, if you will, this Supreme Court decision. So let's say that the government passes these laws, Aryeh Deri gets appointed a minister again, the Supreme Court strikes down the legislative changes, and then a few days later there is a cabinet meeting. The government comes together for its weekly meeting, and Aryeh Deri arrives at the scene. What should the Shin Bet, that's the equivalent of our FBI and also the Secret Service, what should their agents do? Should they allow him into the meeting? The government appointed him a minister, but the Supreme Court just struck down the laws that made this appointment possible. What should these people, the security guards, do? Should they let him in through the door or not? That's the kind of situation we could be facing in Israel a month or two from today.
If it is possible that we're headed towards this constitutional crisis, could this be one of the aims of the coalition, to create this chaos, to ultimately fundamentally grab power through a different avenue?
I think the government doesn't want the constitutional crisis, and I'll explain why. The implications of this constitutional crisis would be very dangerous to the survival of this government. And in fact, I think it's the one thing that could bring it down, because if the Supreme Court strikes down the legislation, what you will see is half or more of this government demanding from Netanyahu to not respect the Supreme Court decision. Obviously, the ultra-religious parties and also some of the more extreme people within Likud will tell him, we are going to do what we want. And if the Supreme Court has its opinions, we're going to ignore them. But this is going to happen at a time when the eyes of the world are on Israel. You guys are interviewing me on this podcast tonight because people in your country, in the United States and elsewhere in the world, are interested in this story. They think this is a drama that involves the values of democracy and freedom. And President Biden is looking at it, and people in the US Senate and other countries. And of course, investors who are thinking, should they enter the Israeli market or not? All of these things are not happening in a vacuum. The implications of Netanyahu accepting this demand by his extremist partners to ignore a Supreme Court decision would be disastrous for the Israeli economy, for Israel's international standing, and also for social cohesion inside the country. All of these scenarios that we've been hearing, that pilots and reservists will not show up for service, and that talented people with money will leave the country, that's actually the one thing that could, push everything off the edge. And I believe Netanyahu will not do it. I don't think he will ignore a decision by the Supreme Court because the consequences will be too severe. But that could bring down his government, because I think some of his partners would be so frustrated and so angry. And they would say, excuse my French, he doesn't have the balls to govern like we want to, and try to get rid of him and maybe force a new election. And so I think the constitutional crisis scenario is very dangerous for the government, and it would like to avoid it. But I think some of the people in the government are miscalculating. They don't understand correctly the current balance of power, and they don't really follow international politics, and they don't understand American politics all that well. Some of them don't speak English all that well. They have I think, completely wrong view of the liberal side of Israel as a bunch of spoiled and soft people in Tel Aviv who just want to have their espresso, and they are not going to really fight for the future of this country and the future of their children in it. And I think they completely miscalculated when they started this process 10 weeks ago. They did not anticipate such a strong resistance from inside Israel. They did not anticipate such a global interest in this story. They did not anticipate the potential economic consequences. And now they are potentially driving towards a brick wall, which at the end of it, there is the Supreme Court. And I think they believed the Supreme Court would be deterred. The justices in the Supreme Court would not dare intervene. But right now, there is a very strong momentum out in the streets and, in the economic sector and from the international community against this government. And I think if the justices of the Supreme Court reached a judicial conclusion that there's a problem with these laws, I don't think the justices would be deterred or they would have any fear to put out a ruling like this. And so I think for the government, that's a big risk right now. And that's why you do see more people in the government, the less extreme ones, calling for compromise, because they realize that this is heading toward disaster. But I'm not sure the more extreme voices in the government understand just how dire the situation is for them.
Amir, talking about how announcing a controversial policy scares investors and has an impact on the macroeconomy of the country, it kind of reminds me of what happened to Liz Truss in the UK. But I want to ask you about another potential risk that this crisis poses. In the United States, we have this concept called wag the dog. It's based on a book and a movie, satirical stories about politics.
Of course. Yeah, it's one of the greatest.
Indeed. And that's a situation where a domestic crisis pushes the government into the use of military force abroad as a diversionary tactic to try to inspire some public support in a rally around the flag moment. This was alleged to have been behind President Clinton's decision to bomb Sudan during the Lewinsky scandal. And we've been seeing some news reporting recently that suggests that the threat from Iran is particularly acute at this very moment because of new standards of enrichment that they've reached. There is perhaps a security basis to take action against Iran. And when we combine that context with this crisis, I'm wondering if the domestic situation might encourage Netanyahu and his government to take military action against Iran.
Maybe, but it would also be a huge risk because right now the public in Israel is so divided that I'm not sure it would work in their favor. It might actually lead to the opposite situation where he would be blamed for, because we've all seen the movie, right? That's the catch here. Maybe if this had happened before the movie, it would work, but everybody would just be saying, listen, this is suspicious. And also I think that the recent development with Saudi Arabia does make it a little more difficult because Netanyahu would want to do this as part of a silent coalition, if you will, with some level of support from important countries in the Arab world. And when you see the Saudis getting closer to the Iranians, I'm not sure that's very helpful. And it's also very difficult to do this without the support or at least some form of a green light from the United States. There's a famous debate among historians about the Israeli decision to open war on Egypt and Syria in 1967, the Six-Day War. Was there a green light from Washington? I think it's pretty clear that Netanyahu would get a red light from Biden for any kind of action against Iran. And so the consequences of doing this when your own country is tearing apart and you don't have the backing or at least a wink from the United States could be disastrous.
Throughout this whole discussion, I was getting flashbacks to the United States during the Trump administration, even the end there, the wag the dog. We had,
oh my God, the last 2 months, yeah.
There were reports that our Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time was worried about, Trump bombing Iran. We had a direct, acute crisis of democracy that thankfully, hopefully is abating.
I agree with you. There are many similarities to the Trump years in America and to other countries in the world that have gone through this kind of process of the weakening of liberal values and liberal democracy. And I do believe that the results of what will happen here in Israel will not be a limited affair for us Israelis. I think this is part of a global fight for the definition of democracy and what it means in the 21st century. And Israel is now a front for this battle, just as Ukraine has become and other countries. And so I think it's important to remember that for us, it's our lives, but for people in the world, I think it will also have important consequences.